As we have gone through the book of Revelation, there's a couple things I hope you've noticed. The first one is there's a lot of Old Testament underneath this prophecy. It's not that God just all of a sudden started talking about future events to John in the Revelation. Israel has had a couple thousand years of God speaking and prophesying or telling the prophets what was going to happen in these end times. That's part of why we have taken the care to go back and see the Old Testament, and that's especially true in Revelation 10. The second thing I want you to remember is that the events that are taking place in heaven, these judgments, are spilling over onto the earth, and that heaven and earth are connected. God is fighting a two-front war, so to speak. One on earth, one in heaven. We've seen in Exodus 12:12, when the Lord freed his people Israel from Egypt, that he not only went to war against Pharaoh, but also against the gods of Egypt, or the demons. So they're connected. That's also important to understand in Revelation 10. Now, Revelation 10 is another interlude. We came across one already in Revelation 7, which was between the sixth and the seventh seals, the seal judgments. And thereafter, finishing the sixth seal judgment before the seventh seal, John tells us about the 144,000. These interludes are very important, and they give background information almost as you're going through this. And remember, there are three sets of seven judgments. There are seven seals, seven trumpets, seven bowls. The seventh seal is the seven trumpets, seventh trumpet is the seven bowls, and seventh bowl is the second coming. So by having an interlude between the sixth and seventh seals, that's the end, really, so to speak, because they're happening very quickly at this point. And now, in chapter 10, we have another interlude, and that's between the sixth and seventh trumpets. But again, the seventh trumpet is all seven bowls. So these things are really, it's announcing the end. And so here in Revelation chapter 10, we're introduced to this angel with a little scroll, and then another set of hidden judgments, seven thunders. And then finally, John is told to eat the scroll. So we'll look at each one of these. Revelation chapter 10, John writes, "Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head. His face was like the sun, his legs like pillar of fire. He had a little scroll open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, and he called out with a loud voice like a lion roaring." Now, who is this particular angel? We don't really know. Certainly, it must be a high-powered angel as an emissary of the Lord, or it is possible that this is a representation of Jesus himself. Now, I know that there are some conservative scholars that would chafe against that, and I understand that. And that's in part because, number one, is that with the incarnation of Jesus, that is when he became fully man, picked up a human nature, this Old Testament character, the angel of the Lord, who was Jesus pre-incarnate, disappears. So it's problematic to see the angel of the Lord in Revelation, but it doesn't call him the angel of the Lord. It calls him an angel. And then secondly, angel is not in and of itself a technical term. It is a generic term meaning messenger, and it can be applied to Jesus. And so this is possibly a picture of Jesus coming with this scroll, and the scroll could be the same scroll that was opened with the seals. And so now he's coming, and here's the full judgment. This is the end of the show, so to speak. This is the end of the judgment. Now, look at how he's described. Not only is he coming down from heaven, but he's wrapped in a cloud. Daniel 7, one like a son of man. Jesus approached the Ancient of Days with a cloud. He's got a rainbow over his head. I don't see that with any other angel, but there is a rainbow of color before the throne of God. His face was like the sun. That describes Jesus in the beginning of the Revelation when he appears to John and gives him the letters to the seven churches. That's not the same appearance that he had when he stepped out of the grave. Also, a couple chapters later, Jesus appears as a lamb. He's a Lion of Judah, but he appears as a lamb. So he can be in an appearance like this. He had legs and pillars of fire. That certainly sounds like the appearance of Jesus early on in the book of Revelation. And so I make that point now, and it will become apparent why I say that a little later, because it really strengthens the understanding of what's going on here, if that is indeed Jesus. Either way, it doesn't make the interpretation fall apart. So notice he has this scroll. Now, it's called a little scroll, but it really could be just the same scroll as we had already seen with the 7 seals. Now it's open. Now he's coming. And so, this scroll is a scroll of judgment and then God's restoration on the other side. It's the end. It's God's full statement as what he's going to do with this rebellion. It's also important that he comes from heaven, but he stands with his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. Now you've covered all 3 bases, so to speak. The earth is described as the sea and the land. Note in prior seals and trumpets that there was judgment against the earth, on the sea, on the land, but also in the heavens. So by this angel, or Jesus, coming from heaven, standing on the sea, standing on the land, and having this scroll of judgment, it's showing that he is, in the name of the Lord, exercising a full and complete judgment in heaven and on earth. Remember, they're connected. It's not just a rebellion that took place on earth. There's a rebellion that took place in the heavens with the devil. And as we go further in Revelation, we will also see that as there is a war that is taking place in the heavens between Satan and Michael the archangel. I know it sounds really weird, but it's an interesting point. Now also, you'll see, he then talks about 7 thunders, but we're going to get back to that in a second. In verse 5, the angel I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised his right hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, the earth and what is in it, and the sea and what is in it, again, all the bases, and that there would be no more delay, but that in the days of the trumpet call to be sounded by the 7th angel, the mystery of God would be fulfilled, just as was announced to his servants, the prophets. So, what is he doing? He's raising his hand before God, proclaiming, time's up. Judgment is now. And so what we're seeing here is Jesus, or his representative, saying the clock has run out. Now, that's important because of its Old Testament background. And that is worth going to see. Go all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 32. Now, Deuteronomy 32 is a song of Moses. It appears twice, 2 songs of Moses in the Old Testament, Exodus 15 and here in Deuteronomy 32. And this is a really bizarre chapter. We don't have the time to go through it all, but it's worth seeing. And the reason why it's worth seeing is Deuteronomy 32, this song of Moses, talks about God's judgment and how it affects heaven and earth, just like Revelation 10. It talks about God's judgment on his people, Israel. Now, in Revelation 10, he's talking about his judgment on the world. But remember Israel's role. God, of all the nations of the earth, God picked Israel to bring about his plan and to forerun the Messiah and salvation. But Israel rebelled. So she also foreruns God's judgment. And that's what we see in Deuteronomy 32. Just like Israel would be the source of salvation, she would also be the example of God's judgment, which in Revelation 10 is on the whole world. It's a very interesting parallel. But more, she also becomes the example of God then saving and delivering. So remember, the scroll judgments are not just God's anger poured out on earth, but also his solution, his redemption through the Lamb and the Lion of Judah, through Jesus. So we're going to go very quickly to Deuteronomy 32, but it really is cool. And you should see how heaven and earth touch. Moses starts out by saying, "Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth." He just wedded heaven and earth. It's like he's bringing together a court case. And it's before heaven and earth. And then he goes on to say how God, the rock, verse 4, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. He's faithful, without iniquity. He's just, he's upright. And then, you, his people, Israel, verse 6, do you thus repay the Lord with all your sinful and rebellious actions? He says, remember in verse 7, the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Well, what does he want them to remember? And here's the famous verses 8 and 9. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders according to the number of the sons of God. We've talked about this before, how God, after Babel, takes the nations and allows these angelic beings to tinker in the affairs of man. He holds them accountable later in Psalm 82. But what you're seeing here, it's almost as if God turns these nations who want to build a tower and become like God. That's when he set the borders of the nations as judgment for Babel. He puts them under this angelic host. But one, that's verse 9, the Lord's portion is his people Jacob, his allotted inheritance. What's he saying? Of all the nations of the world, God picks one. Israel's the forerunner. She's the forerunner of salvation, but she also sadly becomes the forerunner of judgment. And that's what he's reminding. So he's bringing together heaven and earth. These angels are involved in human affairs. And Israel, by rebelling, finds herself squarely under the judgment of God. So he goes on in Deuteronomy 32 to talk about how great God was to Jacob, to Israel, how he blessed it. And then verse 15, but Jeshurun's another name for Israel. Jeshurun grew fat and kicked and grew fat and stout and sleek, and he forsook God, who made him, and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. And they got God angry. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods, with abominations that provoked him to anger. See, heaven and earth again. So here God's nation starts worshiping demons. Heaven and earth. Judgment comes. Verse 17, they sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they'd never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. So what happens? God gets mad. He judges them, and he makes them, who are worshiping no gods, a no people. And so he says in verse 23, I'm going to heap disasters upon them. Israel is forerunning God's judgment. She was forerunning his salvation, now forerunning his judgment. In verse 35, now here's what he's really angry, and he says the famous verse, which we all quote, vengeance is mine. It's quoted in the New Testament as well. Here's where it comes from. Vengeance is mine, and recompense for the time when their foot shall slip, for the day of their calamity is at hand, and the doom comes swiftly. What's he talking about? He's talking about judging the people who are supposed to be his for their wickedness, their idolatry, and for going after these heavenly demons. And the Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone and there's nothing remaining bond or free. So here in verse 35, he's having vengeance. 36, he's talking about saving them. There is the judgment and the reconciliation. That's what Jesus does. He comes and he exercises judgment in the book of Revelation, but he also recreates the new order and offers compassion and mercy because he took the penalty on the cross. Look how Moses closes this song, which truly is amazing because you find it in verse 43. Unfortunately, verse 43 has a lot of textual problems, but the ESV, which I'm reading, has a very good translation, a very solid one. So listen how it says. This is Moses' conclusion, the fact that here the Lord is judging, he's bringing vengeance, vengeance is his, but yet he's also merciful to his people. And it results in rejoice. Rejoice with him, O heavens. That's interesting. Moses just put it back up in the heavens. He doesn't say rejoice, O earth. It starts with the heavens. Rejoice because this is who Jesus is. He judges and he also shows mercy. Bow down to him, all gods. He's still up there talking about these Elohim, these angels. For he avenges the bloods of his children. So he's praising God's justice and he's telling the angels in heaven to do the same thing. Takes vengeance on his adversaries. There's justice. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land. So Moses just took the whole scene, put it up from heaven and earth, connected them together, put Jesus at the center of it. The Messiah is at the center. He's the one who exercises vengeance and judgment, but yet mercy at the same time. What a picture of the cross. Because it's at the cross where he sets us free from the penalty of our sin, but also makes a public spectacle of his enemies, which is the demons in heaven. So heaven and earth, the war in heaven and earth, touch, and they're touching through God himself, and I would argue Jesus. So you go back and you see, well, that's really interesting because Revelation 10, if that angel is Jesus, it's a very tight argument. If not, it still holds as his emissary. But that's the background to it. Now, what does it mean to me? Well, you can't come out of this passage without remembering, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. This is the cry of the age. cry is for justice. The cry is, I mean, even from when we were little kids, right? Little kids, they just want vengeance. You know, it's like you go and you tell your parents, oh, my brother did this, my brother did that. What is he actually looking for? They're looking for vengeance, right? And that's the same where our society's at now. We live in a society right now that's a culture of blame. And I don't think we really fully understand that to make things right comes only at the hands of the Lord. Now, there was an interesting quote I found. It was written by Rowan Williams. It was all the way back in 2008 in the Guardian newspaper from Great Britain. But he was talking about, I think it was about Easter. And there was a very interesting passage that he put in here. And so I quote it. And he says, it's not only that the biblical story, especially in John's gospel, and he's talking about Jesus going to the cross. It's not only that the biblical story, especially in John's gospel, shows us just the mixed motives that can be seen in figures such as Pilate and the high priest. Much more importantly, catch this, the entire message of the Bible on this point is that the problem begins with us, not with them, not with the biblical bad guys. We're the problem. Jesus is killed. Now, this is the part I love this quote. Jesus is killed because people who think they are good are in fact trapped in self-deception and unable to get out of their groove of their self-justifying behavior. And the New Testament invites every reader to recognize this in himself or herself. Let me put it a different way. Vengeance is mine, said the Lord. We have no business in that. We blame people not because we necessarily think that they are wrong, but because we think we are right. We blame people not necessarily because we think they are bad, but we think that we are good. And there's a self-deception there. And that works out in our society, thinking that somehow we can right in a human condition all of the wrongs that are in our society without Jesus. And that's why justice has to come from Jesus. It has to be justice from Jesus, which results in peace. It can never happen by ourselves. We can never set the term of our own justice. But what Revelation 10 says, with the coming of this angel and little scroll, time's up. That there's going to be a reckoning, and it's a reckoning far beyond anything we've imagined. And we'll get to that in a little bit when we get to the last part of this passage. But for now, there's a really weird section about 7 thunders. Let's go to that next.